Hello and welcome to the 17th episode of House, the Shared Living podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to our general chit chat about the shared living sector. And thank you all for your feedback and your input, which we try and implement with every episode. I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategist.
I'm Dan Smith from Student Housing Consultancy.
And I'm Deanie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategists.
We thought we would start today's discussion talking generally about universities. And the reason that this is linked to our podcast and our work is because a lot of our work collectively is in the student accommodation space. We would like to spend a little bit of time just talking about what's in the news and talking about university league tables. So Dan, do you want to kick off? I know you've been doing some research into this.
I have, and went off at a slight tangent, to be completely honest. So yeah, the league tables with QS came out last week, and it was very interesting because it's the first time that Oxford and Cambridge have been leapfrogged. So Imperial College London is now the second best university in the world, according to the QS rankings. And there are multiple different scoring factors that QS use. And all of these rankings vary. They're quite competitive. The Times have their own one. There's various other rankings, but QS and the Times are typically the ones that people look to. So in the UK, you have, on a global level, number 2 is Imperial, number 3 is Oxford, and number 5 is Cambridge. Number 9 is University College London. You then get down to 27, which is Edinburgh, 34 Manchester, 40 King's College, and then 50 LSE. Now that's a bit of a breakdown of the top 50 and where the UK universities have got to. The top university in the world is MIT in the US. But what was really stark was that the number of Chinese universities has increased dramatically in the top 100 ranking and the top 250 ranking overall, and that 58% of UK universities actually dropped in the rankings. And that is obviously not good for business. There are some that have fallen out of the top 100, but yes, 58% of those universities have dropped. It's quite concerning, but at the same time, not surprising. You know, it's only a matter of time before those top universities in China, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere start to catch up with what is a very established and mature higher education system in the UK. I should say the US has also fared similarly in terms of the drop in rankings for their universities. So ultimately, this is just about emerging economies establishing their higher education institutions, and it really should be expected. I don't think it's going to lead to a huge drop-off in student numbers or anything like that, international student numbers in particular. But there are certain credibility issues for some universities that have really dropped down the rankings for various different reasons. Some of them are facing financial challenges. Some of them, their teaching, therefore, has dropped in terms of the quality of their teaching. And that's really something to watch. But it was good news for Imperial. I think there's various different reasons to that, which hopefully we'll come on to. But what did you two both think about the rankings and the fact that UK universities have dropped?
I think it's really sad. And I think it's one of the things that when I came into the sector was something that always was talked about, was how higher education is a massive export for the UK in terms of the economy. And it just goes to show that beating that it's had around trying to, make it less attractive for international students to come here, with the beating it's had with the funding not increasing with inflation. So therefore, actually, when you get tuition fees, you're getting the same amount of money that you got in 2012. So it's no surprise, really, that that's happening, because if you don't invest in these things, then something's going to change. And what we're seeing is, the mix of, as you say, emerging economies kind of really investing in their higher education, which means that they don't have to send their students over here because they can do it in-house. And obviously there has been a growing trend of actually UK universities working in these countries as well in partnership. And it's just really sad that, again, I think we spoke in our last podcast that there's a broken system, a broken higher education system, and it was a massive export. And it's a really shame that we potentially are damaging that as part of the UK economy.
I think historically international students particularly have followed the rankings, and you can see some pretty odd spikes over the years of kind of the second tier universities that have won different rankings, and that they have attracted a huge amount of international students because it says they're number one for research or they're number one for online teaching or whatever it is. So I do think that it makes a difference, because particularly when you're an international student, you don't have much to go on. You're not visiting the universities, you're not going to the open days. So all they really have are these rankings to go on. So, and, I think we have made it a hostile place for international students here. I did hear the other day that there is further interest in students going to America. Australia and Canada have got their own issues. And whilst America certainly have their own issues, it doesn't seem to be impacting kind of student mobility and that kind of university experience. So I think it would be naive to think it won't have an impact really with those top universities. It's competitive, isn't it? And I don't know whether they see it as a competitive business, really.
I was talking to Gabriel from Tong and Sam from Viva City WeChat mini programs at the Students Occupancy Summit the other day, and they were both just saying how important these rankings are for Chinese students in particular. Both of them work within the Chinese student market and have done for years. They fully understand quite how important rankings are. And so when you see that University of Edinburgh drops 3 places, or various other universities have dropped down the rankings, it's definitely concerning to some of those departments. It should therefore be concerning to some of those PBSA operators. So I would definitely be advising PBSA operators to be checking those rankings, see where your university is heading. What's the trajectory? What's the trends that you've seen over the last few years? It shows it on QS. It shows every ranking for the last 10, 15 years. So you can see if your university is on a downward spiral, either in terms of teaching quality or accommodation quality or general experience, student satisfaction, even sustainability. There's lots of different ways that the rankings are done. But I think one of the really, really interesting things that I'm desperate to talk about, and I'm compiling something to put on LinkedIn about it, is the fact that I think, yes, universities are facing a huge challenge with regards to financial sustainability. They're not funded remotely well enough. They need government support or a raise in tuition fees. But I do think there's an opportunity here for their universities to get their houses in order. And I don't think, from what I've seen so far, that the leadership teams in place at a lot of these universities are going to be able to deliver any kind of meaningful change. It's a case of do what you've always done and you'll get what you've always got. Now, when you look at the leadership teams of all of the Russell Group universities, I've got them all here in front of me. There is only one where there is a VC, a vice chancellor, which is effectively your CEO of the university. There is only one in the UK in the Russell Group that has any kind of private or commercial background. There's only one that has worked for private companies. That's Sir Philip Dilley, surprise, surprise, at Imperial College London. So that top performing university has a VC or a chairman effectively overseeing the entire running of the university, who has a commercial and a private sector background. Every other university, all of the VCs started as lecturers, moved up to maybe a heads of department, then maybe head of faculty, then beyond that has gone into VC in some way, shape or form. And I'm wondering if that is leading to a best practice of leadership within universities, or if there is a need for more private sector involvement, because some of these salaries of these VCs are pretty punchy and would be attractive to the private sector. Do we need more commercial leadership within higher education, or is that something of a superpower that everyone who is a VC at a university so far, from what I've seen, apart from this one, Sir Philip Dilley, fully understands the higher education system? I can't help but think that we are missing a trick by not having more private sector involvement. And by that, I mean hiring from the private sector, looking at various other sectors that are not remotely linked to higher education, but where there are transferable skills and, there can be some kind of innovation and dynamism. Because the challenges facing universities right now, there's never been more. With the funding crisis, the student satisfaction crisis in terms of, is university actually good value? There's a lot of students really questioning that right now. Then you look at, AI. How do you run your courses when AI is there? And what does that mean for graduate outcomes when AI is going to become more of a thing? Obviously, the data is absolutely useless in terms of what higher education institutions are either using and producing, from what I've seen so far. So all in all, is higher education set up for success in the way that each university is run? I would really heavily question that.
So I guess what you're saying, Dan, is that a university is like a big corporation. I mean, some of them are like a small town, to be quite frank. And, you don't really, I'm pretty sure none of those VCs are lecturing or have pretty much any interaction with the students whatsoever. So why would they need to have that background in order to run that big business, to run the estates, the finance, the recruitment of staff and students, the P&L, the balance sheets, all of the policy, red tape and everything. When you say it out loud, it doesn't really seem like teaching or academia has got anything to do with it.
I don't think it has. And I think that what I would expect from a VC role or some kind of top level governance role in a university is for the person there to be something of a figurehead. And what I actually think is happening is that they are de facto CEOs of universities. And there's some universities starting to use that term, CEO and Vice Chancellor. Personally, when I went to Loughborough, I didn't have a clue who the VC was. I couldn't have cared less. For me, it was about quality of the experience and quality of the course and the fact that, they would lower the grade boundaries for me. But ultimately, I do think that we are missing a trick by not having more private sector involvement. And just to use the example, my dad was a primary school teacher, worked his way up to deputy head, then on to headmaster of a good primary school, did very well. But the job had therefore changed. And he realised that he was very good at running that school. But when Labour got in, especially, it became more and more difficult to run it. He was effectively running a business. And ultimately, it put him into early retirement because the job had changed so much. I can't help thinking that, and that's my personal experience, of course, but I can't help thinking that the same is applicable to universities where you have a lecturer who works their way up through the system, ends up becoming a VC and is now like, hang on a minute, my turnover is £870 million. That's Warwick University's turnover. And that is run by a VC who's come up through the system. These are £1 billion businesses. And yet you have someone who has effectively been a lecturer and come through the system. That could be great in a lot of ways because they understand what the students need and what the lecturers, etc. need. But do they really have the skills to run a business as a CEO? I would really question that. And I think that, I've seen that Universities UK do a day course and have done in the past for new VCs. It needs a bit more than that. It needs a lot more experience. And I think you can't just build the plane as you fly when it comes to higher education. We do need to make sure that we have the right people in the right roles. And I would seriously question whether we have that at the moment. That's not me saying get rid of any VC who's got any kind of academic experience or is an academic. That's me saying that I think we do need to start looking at hiring from the private sector to really make sure that we have the right people in the right places that can cope with change, create a dynamic and innovative higher education system that's fit for purpose in a changing future.
I think ultimately it's a complex structure that you have in universities, but that structure hasn't really changed since the introduction of tuition fees. And what that changed in universities that they did have to become more commercial, they did have to market their services, they did have to make themselves more attractive to students. And from my experience in working in the sector is very much that what happens with the structure you have with the VC structure is that decision making rightly is coming through that academic arm, but as a consequence it's not matching up with what needs to happen commercially. So therefore you get this massive mismatch between what commercial departments of university are trying to achieve, and they can't cross-reference that with what's happening from the academic side because there isn't that, as you say, I think that one person who actually sits above to run the university and then works with the academic side and the commercial side to make that work. And we do know they're complex structures. We've both worked in them. They don't always communicate with each other effectively, and that's just maximising that disjointed system that is going on, which means the left hand isn't really speaking to the right hand. So it does need change, but I think, Dan, your example of schools is exactly right. I think we've got similar structures in schools that need changing, and I think, I always reflect on this thinking about my own kids' education, is actually the education system hasn't really changed since it was invented structurally, and we're in a totally different world, and we probably do need to take a complete overhaul. But as you say, no one's really going to have the time or resources or support to go ahead and do that. But I think there's definitely fundamental issues that need to be looked at and addressed.
I think just to kind of, I guess, conclude this part of the conversation, And it does all link together. So my stepdaughter's looking at universities at the moment. She'll be starting university next year, and she's going to open days. She's super smart, she's super studious, but she's very, very aware of the financial implications of where she's studying and her potential graduate outcome. She's created a matrix to decide on which university to go to that shows league table for the university, league table for the course that she wants to study, as well as graduate outcome, cost of living. So she's got accommodation in there as well, student satisfaction and well-being scores. So she's created this matrix so that she can decide on which open day she wants to go to and which ones she eventually wants to apply to. And yes, she's quite studious and, very serious about it. But I don't think she's in any way unusual. I think, the students are well aware of the magnitude of the decision that they're making and the financial implications that there is. So I think, again, the sector would be naive to think that students aren't researching if they're not looking at the league tables, they're not looking at the articles and the news reports about these different universities. And I would strongly suggest that any university that's been linked with redundancies, financial difficulty, etc., it's going to be a self-fulfilling cycle, really, because the students will be aware of it, and if you know that your course is in danger or redundancies of your potential course have been had, then, you're not going to apply to it. So anyway, let's keep this conversation live. Like I said, the politicians aren't really talking about universities, so hopefully the people who are interested and invested in it will. One thing that I wanted to talk about that's kind of piqued my attention in the last week or so that I've been driving Deanie mad about is I've been reading about fractional support versus consultancy. And I actually think that we're misselling ourselves as a consultancy, because actually I think what me and Deanie at the Property Marketing Strategist offer is fractional support. And what that basically is, it's like a part-time CMO that you're fully invested in the company, that you come in and you advise, but you also do. Whereas consultancy is a lot of the time advising and then leaving the company that you're advising to kind of get on with the actions. And actually, Dean and I don't do that with our clients most of the time. There are some that only want our advice and recommendations, but most of them we stay heavily involved. And that's actually called like fractional support, which means that you get a CMO part-time. Dan, I don't know what your experience of that is. Would you consider yourself a consultant or somebody that offers fractional support?
Oh, that's an interesting one. And funny, it's very topical. I was talking with Brian Welsh actually about this at the Stu Rent Occupancy Summit and discussing the difference between consultancy and advisory. And effectively, consultancy is where you can come up with a kind of strategy and provide support, but you're also then doing a lot of the legwork and some of the operational work within it. Whereas advisory is more strategic in nature, and you are providing a direction of travel, providing a strategy, and then it's on the company or the client to execute that strategy effectively. And that may be on one-off things, or as retained advisory as you go, or one-off projects. And so I think where I fit into both of those, consultancy and advisory, but also then, I suppose I would consider that I'm doing some fractional work as well. And that is an interesting piece. Any retained client that I've got, I'm heavily invested in that client, and I want to make sure that I can add value in any way, shape or form. But I normally ladder it up to certain KPIs and make sure that I know the tasks that I'm supposed to be doing, where my support is and what should ultimately be done. I can also then delegate through that retained consultancy as well. The advisory piece it pays well, to be honest with you, I think, because it's slightly less operational in nature and it's more geared around experience and knowledge. And so I do a fair bit of advisory, not just because it pays well, but because I think that's what people are looking to me for. That strategic advisory, destination of travel, not necessarily getting into the weeds specifically, but fully understanding the business, not having to actually do the operational legwork, as it were, or do the work, I would say. So that's a really interesting piece. I think there's value in each of those areas. The fractional piece, in particular, when it comes to marketing, is really, really useful for firms of all sizes. And it's the same with ops. It's the same with sales or finance or ESG. And ESG is a great example. That's what we do. We're effectively Good Management Group. My sustainability consultancy is an outsourced ESG department for the likes of Downing, Project Student, and the Fusion Group. various others too that I can't necessarily talk about across BTR and PBSA. So I think there's definitely value in it, especially as some operators and investors do seem to be tightening their belts a little bit. I think that the sentiment is that operators in particular want to run as lean as possible, and investors and developers too want to run as lean as possible for the time being until investment volumes pick up again, possibly in the latter part of this year, but possibly even later. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I've tried to vary my clients as much as I can, so that I have advisory, consultancy, and that sort of retained fractional consultancy piece as well.
I guess if people want support, what do you think different businesses should be looking for?
I think you've got to have an awareness of where you have gaps. And I think one of the reasons we set up our business is because we knew there was massive gaps in marketing across the sectors we work in, that there wasn't, there's very few CMOs actually across the board. And actually it becomes a cost-effective way working with people like us to get that support, because it can be cost effective to get someone full time, especially for those smaller, medium-sized organizations. But you really lose a lot by not having that senior marketing leadership sitting on your board. So I think it is really the first step for any business is to look at that senior leadership team and kind of say, are you covering all bases? Do you have all the strategic insight that you need around that table? Because that is the table that makes the decisions. And if you haven't got that viewpoint at that optimum point in time, and that's when things get missed. And similar to what we're saying about universities, if two sides of a business are not really talking and understanding each other, then one bit of the business makes a decision, and that can have catastrophic or difficult or negative effects on other sides of a business. So I think the first stop is understand where your gaps may be, and then go and see where you can get that support. And I think bearing in mind, we didn't really know that this fractional CMO thing until recently. I think it's what we set out to do, because ultimately we're about strategy, we're about strategic direction. And unless you really understand actually what's going in a business, where they want to get to, who they are, who they want to be, you can't really give that the right advice and the right consultancy and the right things, because you have to understand a business. And I think that's what is a key part of how I've always done my job. How we approach working with our clients is the very first step is to sit down and just say what it is you want to do, where it is you want to be, what are your business objectives, and then we can determine what needs to happen from a marketing perspective. And I just want to say it's kind of something that I could think kind of connects with this, but connects with the conversation we were having last time, where people misunderstand what marketing is about, is that marketing is essentially you being visible. If you're not visible, you can't be seen by your clients. So I think sometimes we need to bring in the right words that people understand what marketing is about. And that's why it's so fundamentally important that you've got that communications voice sitting around that table. And we've said that when we launched, we've continued to say that time and time again, and we will continue to say that because it's so vitally important to your visibility.
I had a really nice lunch yesterday with one of your clients, who I didn't actually know was one of your clients. And they were explaining quite how important your role as strategic consultants was to their business. And I think that there is a real opportunity to plug resource and knowledge gaps in firms of all sizes, because some of them may have maybe less than 5,000 beds, and they're obviously not going to hire a CMO or even probably a marketing director, and they need help not necessarily with executing some of the marketing work because they've got a marketing coordinator, but they need oversight and strategic direction. And that's really important for anyone over 5,000 or 10, 20, 50,000 beds. There's that real opportunity for input on that strategic direction. And I suppose canvassing all opinions, really, because you see so many parts of the sector, and it's the same. This isn't just a love-in. That any consultant can offer that kind of insight. But it's really important that investors, operators, developers see that there is a serious opportunity for another set of eyes to just see where that strategic direction is headed and whether that is the right course. And I think that's really important, as well as executing and actually doing the work. I think there is definitely an opportunity to fill those resource and knowledge gaps with consultants. Of course, I would say that, you would say that is our business. but we can see the gaps in every firm that we look at from a distance, or when we're looking up close and we're very much in the weeds with our clients. And it's just about making sure we can add value. If you don't think that I'm doing a good enough job, then you will not keep me on a retained contract, or that project you won't then look to do further projects after it. So I think the proof is in the pudding. We've got to show that we can add value as consultants or advisors or fractional CMOs or whatever it might be. But there's definitely an opportunity for companies to leverage our experience and our knowledge.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm glad that it's not just me that was kind of confused by the different kind of criteria. And I guess we all just want to do the best job in whatever way we can. And having longevity and knowledge and experience, you can't just get very easily, because there's not many people that have it, and you often can't afford it full time. So whether it's fractional support, consultancy or advisory, the right solution is probably out there regardless of what your needs are. So one thing that I would like to talk about a bit is co-living. I've heard a few murmurings about funding being pulled from different co-living developers and different properties that were due to be built. Some obviously are still coming through, and we're seeing that. And you've also got the other side of it, where single family housing seems to be rising in kind of stature and reputation, which is great. So from your guys' point of view, what are you hearing about co-living?
It's an interesting one. I don't think co-living has the best reputation, and that is born out of what happened at the Collective. And I think that there are some issues around people following in that vein. So what happened at the Collective, effectively, they had a lot of staff, they had very high overheads. It felt like a bit of, the WeWork of co-living, and the company was run into the ground, unfortunately. And it just means that everybody following since then uses the Collective as the first kind of pioneer, that first mover in co-living. And, they did a great job of really running incredible building, an incredible building at the Old Oak. But ultimately, it wasn't viable, and it needed rescuing, and was ended up in administration and I believe liquidation. I'm not 100% sure exactly where that got to. But as a result, everyone following since then uses the Collective as a bit of an example of how not to do things. However, we have seen another couple of big co-living firms go bust as well. So it's not got a great rep at the moment, but there is so much potential there. And I think that hybrid blended living is definitely a way forward. For PBSA, for BTR, whatever you want to call co-living as a kind of subset of BTR, it's just got a bit of a bad rep at the moment. I would like to think that that it will become some kind of mainstream asset class at some point, because I do see the value in it. But at the moment, I think it's still trying to shake off the image of, I suppose, pioneering maverick entrepreneur setting up a co-living brand, and then ultimately that brand failing. That is one of the main problems that I think it has as an asset class at the moment.
I think, and we discussed this before, that we just see co-living very differently to our colleagues over in Europe. And for me, co-living is still very much about smaller units, giving a kind of cozy, homely environment where you can come in and come out, depending on your tenancy length. It might be a month, it might be 3 months, really working for those digital nomads. And I think over here, we seem to be still stuck on this, that it's got to be a 400-bed unit and that's co-living. But really, it's not. And that's probably BTR. That's something else. You don't create a co-living community with 400 people. So that's my view, is that I think there is, like you say, Dan, I think there is actually something really powerful in kind of building co-living units on that kind of small scale, which is really going to add value to kind of another option in this housing crisis that we have. So yeah, I just think we really need to understand what co-living is and the benefits of it, and make it really different to what BTR is, because that's kind of what it should be. And the single family housing, I think we've said before, I think it's great that there's a movement to try and get more rental homes for families. And I know this from a personal reason, because I've got someone in my local community that can't find somewhere to rent. They can afford to rent, but they can't find a house to rent. So they're having to, they don't have anywhere to live right now. And that's a horrible place for them to be in. It's a horrible place for anyone to be in. We just don't have enough rental houses for families. To the point that she's being turned away from 1-bedroom flats because she's got a child. So therefore, she effectively can't take that. So we do need to have a strategy for this. But how do you stop a single family identified house being lived in by effectively multiple occupancy, a group of friends living there? I don't see how you do that unless you've got legislation to make that happen.
I mean, I guess it's called single family housing, but why can't sharers live in a house? Because at the end of the day, it's all just solving the housing crisis. And the reason that single family housing came about is because there's not enough HMOs of good quality and good management. So does it matter who lives in them? Or are you just saying that actually it's taking it away from people that really need it?
I don't disagree with that, but don't call it single family housing, because you're then building something that is meant to be for someone, but that's not necessarily, just call it housing, or rental housing, or let's just get the terminology right. Because I think, the general consumer is confused enough anyway. They don't know what BTR is. They don't know what co-living is. They don't know what PBSA is. So let's just simplify it and just build more houses. But as we spoke in our last episode, we've got an election coming. Nothing's going to happen soon. But yeah, we just need more houses in the right places and the right type of houses in the right locations. And that's what we don't have. And that is a big problem impacting us all.
I do think that's where co-living is a real opportunity, and that blended living. And it excites me looking at the likes of the Social Hub, formerly Student Hotel, and how they're marrying hospitality, co-living and student accommodation, PBSA. I can see a lot more of that happening, especially with the changes in tenancy lengths and, showing a bit more flexibility to renters, to students, to pretty much anyone and everyone, because flexibility is going to be the name of the game when it comes to higher occupancy at some point. Not yet, but at some point you are going to, or certainly higher revenue overall. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think co-living has a long way to go to prove itself. But I think, you can see the green shoots after what's been quite a turbulent time for various different co-living pioneers. So hopefully the industry will go from strength to strength and alleviate some of the housing crisis, because there's definitely a role in the graduates and the recent graduates moving from PBSA into co-living, or also that blended living that we've just talked about. So definite opportunity, but yeah, it's tough out there at the moment if you're talking co-living.
I guess it's all connected, because if co-living was actually co-living in the way that the Europeans do it, e.g. shared flats, then you wouldn't necessarily have people living in single family housing as sharers. So I think all of these kind of new solutions need to solve the problem. And I'm not sure that co-living is solving a problem yet, because a lot of those young graduate kind of age people want to live with other people, as they have been in homes of multiple occupancy for years and years. They don't want to live in studio flats, because if they wanted to live in studio flats, they'd be living in studio flats. If co-living was actually co-living, you would have to work much less hard on that communal side of things, because actually people would have that community within their shared flats. I still kind of see co-living as student accommodation for graduate. It's, that communal lifestyle. So perhaps, Deanie, to your point, that's why the single family housing isn't kind of quite segregated yet, because it's attracting sharers because they've got a lack of places to live as well.
Exactly. I think co-living has an identity crisis in terms of, we just don't know what to deem as actual co-living. I've got a client, Grayson's, who has been doing co-living for years, literally 10 years, because they're housing young professionals and they're offering the same services as students. As they would to their students in PBSA. There are numerous other operators doing the same thing. At Nido, we had 2 floors of effectively co-living, because it wasn't just students that lived there. So I do think that we're doing it in different ways, shapes and forms. And I don't think Unite, for example, have been brave enough on their new BTR product to call that co-living. But I can see more and more moving into it. Scape, Host, various others are really starting to think about co-living and what that actually means. So I think the industry will define itself from within, and in maybe 5 years' time, we'll end up with really clear mainstream asset classes with PBSA and then co-living and BTR being separate. So yeah, it is an interesting area for sure.
I just think, Dan, when we do that, I'm just hoping that we develop that based on what the data is telling us that the market wants, which we haven't really done in PBSA. And I think we really need to do, because my first thought is, as a graduate, the last thing I wanted to do was go and live on my own in a studio flat. Okay, yeah, I could be part of a 400 thin community. But what I really loved about my graduate home was that I moved to London with a bunch of people that didn't really know that well, and got a whole new group of friends and a whole new way to experience London alongside the work colleagues I was working with during the day, and then my family back at home. And that's a really important step in life. And I just think I'd find it hard to believe that all the Gen Z generation that are graduating now are going, yeah, I absolutely want to go and live in a studio. That's what I want to go and do.
Can't just be about studios. We have to be thinking outside the box here and trying to alleviate the housing crisis. Co-living definitely has a place for that.
We'll watch this space.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I enjoyed that chat. I hope everybody listening did as well. Believe it or not, we've recorded 2 podcasts this week and we haven't run out of things to say. So thank you all so much for listening. Please like and share with your colleagues as well so that they can get involved in these conversations too. And we will catch up with you again next week. Thank you very much.